Welcome to My Finance Teacher, and today we're talking GDP, or Gross Domestic Product. Gross Domestic Product is the market value of all the final goods and services produced within your country in a given period of time. Within this definition, we want to emphasize four important components, which are market value, final goods and services, which are produced in a given country within a given period of time. Next, let's talk about these four components one by one, starting with the market value. In terms of adding to the value of GDP, which combination would add a greater value? Producing 100 apples and 50 oranges? Or producing 50 apples and 100 oranges? To answer this question, you need to be able to compare the value of apples with the value of oranges. And if we use market values, that is one way of comparing apples with oranges, as well as adding those together. For example, if your state last month produced only 100 apples and 50 oranges, then the monthly GDP over the last month of the state, given the price of $4 per apple and the price of $5 per orange, would be $650, within which 400 is the value of all the apples produced and 250 is the value of all the oranges produced in the state last month. This would give us a monthly GDP, the GDP over 1 month. Next is the final goods and services. What do we mean by final goods and services? And what other goods and services are there which are not final? Final goods and services are the goods and services that are used by a final consumer. For example, if a family buys a car, then this car is an example of a final good that is used by the family. As opposed to that, there are intermediate goods. There are intermediate goods which are not bought by a final consumer. They are instead bought by another firm and are used in production of another good or service. For example, the tires that the car manufacturer bought are intermediate goods which were not used by the final consumer, the tires themselves. Instead, they were used in the production of another good, which is a car in this case. Sometimes a good can be either intermediate or final depending on the situation. For example, those tires, if they were bought by a car manufacturer, we saw that they would be an intermediate good, as they would be used in a production of another good, which is a car. Instead, if tires were bought by a car owner, they would be an example of a final good, because the car owner would be the final user of those tires. When we talk about GDP, the value of GDP, what we add is only the value of final goods, even if the intermediate goods are also produced within the same country. The value of those goods are not added separately, since the value of those goods are already included within the value of the final goods. For example, if the price of a car is $40,000, these $40,000 already include the value of the tires. Hence, we don't need to add the value of the tires in addition to the price of the car. Some goods are not final and not intermediate, and they are not part of GDP. Some second-hand goods, for example, are not part of GDP since they had been produced in previous years rather than a year for which we're trying to calculate GDP. And financial assets such as bonds, for example, are not a final or an intermediate good, and they are not part of GDP. You can think of them as rather a promissory note to repay some funds in the future. The next component within the definition of GDP states that the final goods and services are counted as part of GDP only when they are produced within the country. What is meant here is regardless of the owners of the manufacturers, the GDP is calculated based on the location rather than the ownership of the firms. For example, shoes produced by Nike in Vietnam would be counted as part of GDP of Vietnam rather than part of US GDP, even though Nike is an American company. The next component is within a given period of time. Usually GDP measures relate to a given period of time, which is most commonly a year, in which case we get an annual GDP, or a quarter, in which case we get a quarterly GDP. This concludes our definition of GDP. If it has been useful, consider subscribing.